It was a rainy night when it happened. Working alone on the night shift, I always felt a certain unease walking through the empty corridors of the hospital, where every shadow seemed to hide unresolved secrets. Hospitals are places of healing, but at night, they transform into settings for paranormal phenomena and urban legends. Real facts reported by colleagues about apparitions and disembodied voices always kept me alert. In this hospital, known for its history of inexplicable events, every night shift was a true test of courage. The elders said that the hospital was built on an old cemetery, and many believed that disturbed souls still roamed there. Personal experiences of nurses and doctors reported apparitions of a female figure wandering the corridors, always accompanied by a penetrating cold and an oppressive silence, making the environment even more terrifying. The tension was palpable, and the gloomy atmosphere only amplified the fear. The feeling of being watched was constant, and often when passing through the deactivated surgery rooms, one could hear the echo of old operations, whispers that had no source. Unresolved mysteries like these were common around here, but what I didn't know was that this night would be different. I was about to have my own horror story and confront something that would challenge my very reason. As the night advanced, I found myself on the third floor, checking equipment and making routine notes. The rain beat against the windows, and the wind whistled through the cracks, as if it wanted to tell its own horror stories. Everything seemed normal until a noise made me stop. It came from the closed wing, where no one should be at that hour. I decided to investigate, thinking it was some faulty equipment or perhaps a colleague needing help. Supernatural reports from colleagues crossed my mind as I approached. The door to the wing was ajar, which was strange since it was always locked at night. I pushed the door cautiously, and the creak sounded like a harbinger of something frightening. The corridor was dark, only illuminated by a flickering light at the end, which looked more like a warning than a source of light. My heart was pounding, and every step seemed to echo down the corridor. Then I saw something that chilled my spine. A medication cart, which should have been stored away, was slowly moving down the corridor as if someone invisible was pushing it. There were no open windows to justify the movement, and the air was still, heavy with a silence broken only by the intermittent sound of the flickering light. Paranormal phenomena like this were talked about, but seeing them up close was a completely different reality. The tension increased, and I knew that something more was coming. Some unknown force seemed to be playing with reality, altering it in subtle but deeply disturbing ways. As I approached the cart, my mind tried to find a logical explanation, but every theory vanished in the face of the irrational. My hesitant steps took me to the cart, which stopped abruptly as if waiting for me. With my heart pounding in my chest, I felt a presence, a cold energy surrounding me. It was a strange sensation, as if someone was right beside me, watching my every move. I decided to move forward despite the consuming fear. It was as if every corner of the hospital hid horror stories and hauntings that only waited for nightfall to reveal themselves. Suddenly, I heard a faint cry coming from one of the examination rooms. It was a scary sound, a muffled sob that seemed to carry centuries of pain. Without thinking, driven by an almost heroic impulse, I went towards the sound. The door was slightly ajar, and when I opened it, the sound suddenly stopped, leaving only the echo of my own accelerated breathing in the air. I looked around. The room was empty. However, in the corner, there was an old stretcher covered with dirty sheets. As I approached and touched the fabric, I felt a cold hand grab my arm. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. The fear turned into terror, and the reality of what was happening began to become palpable. The personal experience with the paranormal was transforming me. I was no longer just an observer. I was part of those horror stories, experiencing firsthand the paranormal phenomena I so feared. Walking back down the corridor, with the image of the cold hand still vivid in my mind, my sense of reality began to unravel. It was clear that something or someone wanted to convey a message, or perhaps a warning. The anguish I felt was amplified by the loneliness of the environment and the darkness that seemed to consume everything around. With each step, the weight of the unknown grew, and I knew I needed to find answers. Passing again through the corridor where I had found the cart, a light at the end of the corridor started flickering frantically, as if trying to get my attention. Hesitant but compelled by a need to understand, I followed the light. The corridor seemed different now, longer, as if it were stretching out before me. Strange sounds, like whispers and muffled laughter, began to blend with the wind whistling outside, creating a macabre symphony that accompanied me. Reaching the end of the corridor, I found a door I had never noticed before. It was ajar, and through the crack, a red light pulsed softly. My heart was beating so loudly that I could almost hear its echoes against the hospital walls. I pushed the door, and what I saw inside defied any logic. A room that looked like a time capsule, filled with old objects and faded photographs covering the walls. In the center, an old gramophone played a sad and repetitive melody. This revelation not only deepened the mystery, but also served as a profound hook for what was yet to come. At that moment, I realized that the answers I sought might be there, hidden in that room that time seemed to have forgotten. The interior of the room was a capsule from another era, each object a relic that seemed to vibrate with untold stories. The gramophone's melody filled the air with a melancholic nostalgia, making the atmosphere even more immersive. Among the photographs on the walls, one in particular caught my attention. It showed a group of doctors and nurses, all dressed in old uniforms, posing in front of the hospital itself. But what made me freeze was seeing, in the background, the same female figure that many claimed haunted the corridors, her face blurred and indistinct, but unmistakably present. As I observed the photograph, a cold breeze swept through the room, and the gramophone abruptly stopped playing, plunging the room into a sepulchral silence. The air seemed to get heavier, as if the atmospheric pressure had changed. Suddenly, small objects began to move subtly, displaced by invisible forces. Books trembled on their shelves, and a small glass ball rolled on its own until it stopped at my feet. I picked up the glass ball, and inside it, a small winter scene swirled with snowflakes dancing chaotically. Looking closer, I saw a tiny figure in the ball scene, surprisingly similar to the woman in the photo. When our gazes seemed to cross, a chill ran down my spine. It was as if she was trying to communicate through this small window to another world. The feeling that these events were not mere coincidences, but parts of something much larger and more complex, began to crystallize. The room, with its mysterious objects and the constant presence of that female figure, seemed to be the epicenter of something inexplicable, a portal to truths that defied human understanding. Holding the glass ball, I felt an undeniable connection to the mysterious woman. The room seemed to pulse with a palpable energy, as if the walls were breathing, saturated with ancient secrets and suffering. I decided that I needed to understand the woman's connection to the hospital and possibly to the inexplicable phenomena occurring. Taking a deep breath, I placed the glass ball back in its place and turned to the rest of the room, determined to discover more. As I explored, the objects around me seemed to react to my presence. Photos trembled on the walls, and an old diary fell from a shelf, opening to a page marked by a faded photograph. It was her again, the woman, this time clearly identifiable, labeled in the photo as the head nurse from the early century. The text next to the photo revealed that she had mysteriously disappeared after a series of tragic events at the hospital, events that were never explained. With the discovery, the air grew colder, and the sound of approaching footsteps became audible. My heart raced as I slowly turned. There she was, the nurse from the photograph, standing at the door, looking directly at me with eyes that knew much more than any living person could. The apparition was translucent, her contours glowing faintly in the dim light escaping through the covered windows. She approached, and with each step, the floor seemed to tremble subtly. "Why are you here?" Her voice was a whisper that resonated with a sad melody, almost lost in time. I couldn't speak, paralyzed by the reality of her presence. She continued, "You sought answers, now see where they have brought you." With those words, the room began to spin, and images of past events projected on the walls like dancing shadows, showing scenes of despair and anguish that had occurred there. It was a veil being lifted over the dark truth the hospital hid, a story of pain and mystery that now completely enveloped me. The feeling of dread was overwhelming, and the line between the past and present began to blur, leaving me at a crossroads of time and reality. As the room spun and images of past tragedies unfolded around me, the nurse remained still, a guardian of memories refusing to be forgotten. With each scene of anguish that passed through the walls, a part of me felt the weight of the history and pain that place held. These are the hidden truths, The pieces of soul that this hospital keeps prisoners, she said, her voice now stronger, echoing against the old walls. The images suddenly stopped, and the room stabilized. The nurse, or what was left of her, pointed to the diary on the floor. Take this, know our story, share our suffering. Do not let our past be lost in the shadows. Her figure began to fade, as if her energy was consumed with every word she spoke. I picked up the diary, feeling its worn cover and the yellowed pages by the hands of time. The nurse disappeared completely, leaving behind only the echo of her presence. I was alone again in the room, but the sense of isolation was now accompanied by an immense responsibility to reveal the hidden story of that hospital. As I left the room, the corridor seemed different, lighter somehow, as if acknowledging and accepting those stories had altered something fundamental in the atmosphere of the place. I walked back to the main area of the hospital, each step resonating with a new awareness of the depth of what I had experienced. The dawn was beginning to peek over the horizon, and with it, a sense of renewal. However, the unease remained, an indelible mark of what I had experienced. The story of that hospital, intertwined with the pain and mysteries of its past, was now a part of me, a burden and a call to share what I had discovered, so that those who had suffered would not be forgotten. It was a night like any other at the hospital, at least until the lights began to flicker strangely. The long, dimly lit corridors of the old building seemed even gloomier and more isolated. It was almost midnight, and except for the hurried footsteps of nurses and the occasional beep of a monitor, everything was eerily silent. I and another nurse, an elderly lady with whom I had formed a special bond during our treatment, were sitting in the hospital's small internal garden, a place that, despite being familiar, was starting to feel like the setting of one of those urban legends we had heard about. Our conversations about horror stories and supernatural accounts had always been a way to pass the time, but that night seemed intent on bringing those stories to life. The shadows on the walls danced with a life of their own, and the cold wind whispering through the window cracks carried with it almost inaudible murmurs. Paranormal phenomena, or just our imagination? Hard to say. The hospital's nighttime atmosphere always had something mysterious about it, as if every corner hid secrets or hauntings. For me, this became even more tangible when the other nurse pointed to the corner of the corridor and whispered, "Did you see that?" She was pale, her eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. It looked like someone, but when I looked again, there was no one there, she continued, her voice trembling with inexplicable events and unresolved mysteries. While the other nurse tried to compose herself, my gaze wandered through the empty corridors, seeking some logical explanation. It was common to hear stories about the old hospital, especially at night, when the boundaries between reality and imagination seemed to blur. The flickering lights created a play of light and shadow that turned the familiar into the terrifying. Curiosity overcame my fear, and I suggested we explore a bit. We walked slowly, supporting each other, the echo of our steps mixing with muffled sounds that seemed to come from the walls. The hospital at night transformed. What during the day was a refuge, at night seemed like a labyrinth of inexplicable events. The air was heavy, charged with a tension we couldn't ignore. We arrived at the old Block C, a wing that had been closed for years due to an endless renovation. The door, usually locked, was ajar. A cold draft passed by us, bringing with it a damp, old smell. The other nurse hesitated, but something about that place drew us inside. There, the silence was even deeper, interrupted only by the distant sound of something that sounded like a whisper. The stories we told each other about hauntings and unresolved mysteries started to seem less like entertainment and more like a warning. As we advanced, the whispers became clearer, almost as if someone was conversing right beside us, but with no one there. The feeling of being watched grew, an inexplicable cold running down my spine. As we ventured deeper into Block C, the air seemed to become denser, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. The other nurse clutched my arm tightly, her expression a mix of fear and fascination. "Do you feel that?" she whispered, her voice barely rising above the sound of our cautious steps. I nodded, unable to form words, my mind whirling trying to understand what was happening. Every shadow seemed to move with intent, as if the hospital itself had a life of its own. Our hearts beat in unison, a symphony of anxiety and expectation. The corridor ahead of us seemed to stretch infinitely, the closed doors guarding secrets of past decades. One of them, unexpectedly, was adorned with deep scratches, as if someone or something had tried to escape from the room behind it. Fear was now palpable, pressing against our chests like a dark wave. But at the same time, there was a strange attraction, an almost masochistic desire to discover what lay beyond those walls that whispered horror stories. The other nurse, always the braver of us, took a step forward, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. When the door opened, a sharp scream echoed down the corridor, cutting through the silence like a knife. The sound was not human, it was primal, a reminder that not all the stories we tell are just fiction. In the room, the dim light revealed dark stains on the floor and walls, or were they just shadows? And an empty wheelchair in the center, slowly spinning as if someone had just gotten up. We both instinctively recoiled, the reality of our encounter with the unknown finally sinking in. The door slammed shut behind us, as if pushed by an invisible hand, and the sound of our own screams mixed with a distant echo of the previous scream. The adventure had taken a turn that neither of us could have anticipated. Catching our breath after the scare in the room, the other nurse and I looked at each other, a mixture of fear and disbelief in our eyes. "We have to get out of here," I murmured, my voice reflecting the trembling I felt inside. The other nurse, however, gripped the doorknob with a determination that only true curiosity and terror can conjure. "No, something is happening here, something that needs to be discovered," she insisted, her voice firm despite the evident fear. Against my better judgment, I followed the other nurse back into the room. The wheelchair was now still, as if the brief moment of life we had witnessed was just a trick of the mind. The light flickered, casting patterns that seemed almost symbolic on the stained walls. And then we saw the diary. It lay on a dusty table, its worn cover indicating years, perhaps decades, of guarded secrets. With trembling hands, I opened the diary. The first pages were filled with normal entries, the daily life of a long-term patient. But as the pages progressed, the writing became more erratic, the words interwoven with drawings of eyes and strange symbols. "Something was tormenting this patient," the other nurse whispered, reading over my shoulder. The last entries spoke of voices whispering at night, of shadows moving against their own will, of a growing fear that seemed to consume the author. "He saw what we are seeing," she concluded, the revelation bringing a new wave of chills. We decided to investigate further, driven by the need to understand what had afflicted that patient, what perhaps still resided within those walls. The corridor led us to more rooms, each marked by signs of a presence that couldn't be easily explained. Doors that slammed on their own, whispers that seemed to follow our steps, a cold that intensified with each step we took. As we explored the hospital's abandoned corridors, every shadow and every sound seemed to carry its own weight, a hidden story. The diary became our guide, each entry leading us deeper into the mystery surrounding the hospital. With each new page read under the flickering light of our flashlight, more pieces of the puzzle fell into place, each revealing a bit more about the repetitive patterns of strange events that happened there. The description spoke of a bloody figure appearing in mirrors, disappearing as quickly as it appeared. Other times, the diary's author mentioned objects moving on their own, books falling off shelves without being touched, and a shadow without an owner wandering the corridors at night. The reality of these events became more palpable and terrifying as we experienced similar phenomena. When we reached the end of the corridor, one door in particular caught our attention. It was different from the others, covered in scratches and claw marks, as if someone or something had desperately tried to get out, or in. With a deep breath, we pushed the door, which creaked in protest before opening fully. What we saw next was something none of us was prepared to face. In the center of the room, a large dust-covered mirror reflected not only our trembling figures, but also a distorted figure that was not physically present in the room with us. The figure seemed to be watching us, its eyes a pair of dark abysses promising secrets and terrors beyond human understanding. The other nurse, with a courage I could barely understand, stepped forward, her voice trembling as she spoke directly to the mirror. "Who are you? What do you want from us?" The words had barely left her lips when the air around us began to cool, and the figure in the mirror started to become clearer, more defined. The tension in the air was palpable, a mix of fear and fascination. We were trapped in a loop of horror and discovery, each answer raising more questions. Who was this figure? What was its connection to the hospital and the events described in the diary? And more importantly, what did this mean for us, who had unearthed these forgotten secrets? The silence that followed was almost as oppressive as the presence now staring at us through the mirror. The figure, more defined, showed a face marked by an expression of pain and despair. Its lips moved, and although no sound reached our ears, the cold air carried its words directly into our minds. "Free me." The other nurse and I exchanged glances, a mix of fear and determination in our eyes. We knew we had gone too far to simply turn back. "What do you need to be freed?" the other nurse asked, her voice a whisper barely audible. The answer came not through words, but in a series of quick images that danced on the mirror's surface. Scenes of a hospital in earlier times, a devastating fire, patients forgotten and lost amidst the chaos. It was now clear that something terrible had happened at that hospital, something that left marks not just on the walls and corridors, but also on the souls of those caught in the tragedy. The figure in the mirror was one of those souls, trapped between worlds, its pain and torment becoming part of the place's fabric. "How can we help you?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. The figure pointed to the diary, still open on the table. We flipped through the pages, each revealing more of the horror, but also a clue, a ceremony incomplete, a broken promise to return and help. With renewed determination, the other nurse and I decided to complete what had been left unfinished. We prepared the space, repeating the words written with care, each syllable an echo of the hopes and fears of those forgotten by time. When we finished, the mirror trembled, the figure in the glass giving one last look before disappearing, its expression a mix of relief and deep sadness. The air around us warmed slightly, as if an oppressive presence had finally been alleviated. Leaving the hospital that night, dawn was beginning to break the grip of darkness. I knew things would never be the same. We had touched something beyond the mundane, something that would change us forever. The answers we sought had been found, but at what cost? The hospital would remain, its history a layer upon another, always ready to be uncovered by those brave or foolish enough to look. Every time night fell over the old hospital on the outskirts of the city, a shroud of silence and desolation enveloped the place. It was an ancient building, with long dimly lit corridors and rooms that seemed to hold stories from a forgotten era. The streetlights around the building barely pierced the darkness, and the full moon only added a silvery glow to the dusty windows. In this setting, the horror story began to take shape, fueled by supernatural accounts from those who dared to cross its doors after dark. They said that in the empty corridors, one could hear the distant crying of a child, but following the sound only led to the echo of one's own footsteps. This place, once a haven of healing, had now transformed into a stage for paranormal phenomena and inexplicable events that defied any logical explanation. It was as if the hospital retained the souls and memories of all who had passed through it, becoming a living archive of personal experiences and unresolved mysteries. The atmosphere of the place not only instigated fear, but also a morbid curiosity about what truly happened at night when the supposedly empty hospital began to tell its own scary stories. That night, as usual, the night guard started his shift, a routine he had adopted as normal despite the peculiar stories circulating among the staff. He walked through the corridors with his flashlight, whose flickering light only heightened the sense of isolation. When he passed the second floor, something unusual caught his attention. The sound of a ball bouncing in the empty corridor echoed through the walls. Following the sound, he found a red rubber ball stopped in the middle of the path, as if waiting for someone to play. Intrigued and a bit apprehensive, he looked around but found no one. Deciding to ignore the occurrence, he continued his patrol, but couldn't help but notice the temperature had dropped abruptly, a detail that didn't fit with the logic of such an old and supposedly empty building. The mystery deepened when, while checking one of the locked rooms, he heard the sound of children's laughter. The door, which should have been securely closed, was ajar. With bated breath and a racing heart, he pushed the door open only to find the room empty, except for a small toy car moving on its own across the worn wooden floor. This series of anomalies and inexplicable disappearances added to the scary cases whispered in the shadows of the hospital. It was the turn of a nurse, a middle-aged woman with years of experience, who always prided herself on never giving in to the fears and urban legends surrounding the hospital. That night, however, her courage would be put to the test. While preparing medications in the nursing room, a sudden blackout plunged the floor into darkness. The emergency light flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls as if they were breathing. With a flashlight in hand, she decided to investigate the cause of the interruption, driven more by the obligation to ensure the safety of the place than by her own will. Along the way, her radio emitted only static, until a weak, trembling voice whispered her name through the interference. "Help me." The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time, putting her on high alert. Her emotions oscillated between the determination of a trained professional and the human fear of the unknown. Her heart pounded as she approached the end of the corridor, where the silhouette of a child was briefly seen in the light of her flashlight before disappearing behind a door. Each step was heavy, and every shadow was a potential threat. The tension grew, fueled by paranormal phenomena that tested her sanity and inexplicable events that defied any logical explanation. That night in the hospital was unlike any other. After her incident, other occurrences began to emerge, as if a Pandora's box had been opened. The guard, returning to his post after investigating a suspicious noise, noticed that the security cameras captured images that seemed to distort reality. People who weren't there appeared for a moment and vanished without a trace. Meanwhile, a doctor on duty reported his computer turning on and off by itself, important documents disappearing from locked folders, and the unsettling feeling of being watched. Each event was an initial hook that drew the involved deeper into the mystery, making them question not only their safety but their own sanity. As the night advanced, so did the suspense. With each new twist and supernatural behavior, the hospital workers felt like characters in a real horror story, where the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural were constantly tested. Every shadow could hide a new haunting or a real fact more terrifying than the last. As the night wore on, the phenomena in the hospital became more intense and frequent. She, still shaken, noticed a disturbing pattern. Always at midnight, the lights flickered 3 times, and the child's crying grew louder and closer. These repetitive patterns served as a sinister prelude to even more bizarre events. On one of these nights, while following the sound of the crying to the hospital's basement, where old files and deactivated equipment lay forgotten, she found an old diary. The yellowed pages contained accounts from other staff members over the years, all mentioning the same shadowless child, a recurring presence seemingly tied to the hospital. At the same time, objects began to move on their own. Chairs slid down the corridors, locked doors opened and closed without human intervention, and the cold in the environment became almost palpable. These strange objects and phenomena added a layer of mystery that defied rational explanations, fueling the supernatural accounts circulating among the few brave souls who still wandered the hospital at night. As the night neared its end, the tension in the hospital reached its peak. She and the doctor and the guard, now gathered, faced the reality that something incomprehensible and terrifying was happening. They had shared their experiences, noting how the events seemed to intensify and repeat with alarming precision. Determined to find answers, they headed to the basement one last time. There, they found the diary open to a page that spoke of an incident decades ago, where a child had been forgotten in the hospital and never found again. With each line read, the sounds of the child seemed to echo through the walls, as if the story narrated in the diary was unfolding again. With the break of day, the phenomena ceased suddenly, leaving behind only silence and confusion. There were no clear answers, only theories and the weight of uncertainty. The ambiguous ending kept everyone on edge, unable to fully process what they had experienced. The psychological impact was profound, marking each with a sense of trauma and guilt for not having unraveled the mystery or helped the child who perhaps still wandered those corridors. The next night, she couldn't avoid returning to the hospital, despite the growing fear that now haunted her. Every step she took through the corridors echoed the events of the previous night. The hospital, now a place of unresolved mysteries, would not let her rest. The fear came not just from the supernatural experiences, but from the persistent feeling of being watched. The doctor, on the other hand, found himself tormented by curiosity. He had spent the previous night reviewing medical records, trying to find any clue about the identity of the forgotten child. His mind, always rational, now struggled against the reality of the paranormal phenomena he had witnessed. Every shadow seemed to hide a haunting, every sound echoed the laughter or crying of that mysterious child. The guard, a practical and skeptical man, felt his courage waver. What he had once considered urban legends now seemed to be real events, experiences he had lived through himself. Emotion swung between the curiosity to uncover the truth and the fear of facing something beyond human comprehension. Together, they formed a group of survivors of a night of pure terror, bonded by the shared trauma and the need to understand what was happening. The emotional connection between them was palpable, each relying on the others to maintain sanity in the face of the inexplicable events that continued to haunt the hospital. Returning to the hospital, the nurse, the doctor, and the guard were determined to confront the mystery once and for all. The tension was almost tangible. Every shadow seemed to move with a life of its own, and the air was heavy with a growing sense of dread. They decided to venture deeper into the basement, following a collective instinct that the answers lay there. As they descended the creaking steps, the sound of the child laughing and crying became more distinct, guiding them like a sinister thread. At the bottom of the basement, they found a door they had never noticed before, locked with a rusty padlock. With a combined effort, they managed to open the door, revealing a small, dark room decorated with old toys and children's drawings on the walls. In the center of the room, a small bed lay empty but still made, as if waiting for its occupant. The temperature dropped drastically, and they all felt a chill run down their spines. Suddenly, the figure of the child appeared in the dim light, looking at them with empty, sad eyes. She reached out her hand, as if asking for help. The vision was interrupted by an invisible force that swept through the room, throwing toys and papers into the air. The nurse tried to approach the child, but was repelled by a powerful, unknown energy. The doctor shouted for everyone to get out, but his voice seemed lost in the whirlwind of supernatural events unfolding. Finally, with one last effort, they all managed to leave the room, locking the door behind them. The hospital seemed to return to normal, but the sense of unease remained. They looked at each other, understanding that they had witnessed something they could never fully explain. It left them with more questions than answers and a sense of trauma they would carry forever. Each of them knew the hospital would never be seen the same way again. The supernatural accounts, the scary cases, and the paranormal phenomena had become part of their lives, a constant reminder that some unresolved mysteries perhaps should remain so.